Hello, hello, and welcome to Salon London. So these salons are part of our Big Ideas series that we're doing for lockdown, and the idea is then that they're really designed to help us spend a bit of time with kind of important ideas that perhaps we wouldn't get a huge amount of time to consider in any great detail in our everyday lives. And it's really important we do, because they're full of such brilliant ideas that we can take back into our own life for, finding new influences and inspirations for how to live. Thank you so much for joining us, as tonight we are really taking a good look at boredom. And I hope we get a chance to consider boredom anew. We're in really, really good hands with James and John, and I'll be introducing them in just a second. But first of all, I should explain a little bit about how it works. I'm Helen Bagnall. I'm one of the founders of Salon London, and all of the work we do is to try and engage us with big ideas. You may know us from Salon London in London, or Salon North up in North Yorkshire, or at the Also Festival, where I hope that I've met some of you or will meet some of you. I'm going to be talking to John and James. Yes, we've got two speakers for you tonight, both in Canada. And I'm going to be talking to them for about 30 minutes. And then we will be opening up for questions. Do feel really free to put your comments and questions to James and John. This really is your time in lockdown. I have to announce we have a new chat feature on our platform designed by the incredible Dickon Towns, and so you should be able to, at any time, if there's anything that strikes you want to ask, put in your questions, and then when we go to questions with James and John, I can ask them. Well done, Dickon. And for those of you, or if it doesn't work, I think some of you have got if you booked on, have got the text number. You can always text my phone, and then I can ask the questions to John and James then. So, boredom. Let me introduce. First, I'm going to introduce Professor James Danckert. James, you going to wave?
Yeah, hi. Pleasure to be here.
So that's James, and James is a professor of psychology and a cognitive neuroscientist, and he's based at the University of Waterloo in northeast Canada, and is a renowned expert on boredom, and one of the authors of the book and Out of My Skull. And then we now have John. And say hello, John.
Hello. Hello.
That's Dr. John Eastwood there. He's a clinical psychologist, and he heads up the Boredom Lab, which is dedicated to deepening our understanding of boredom. And he's based at York University, but that's in Toronto. So, hello, James. Hello, John. I have to ask one of the big questions of all time, and that is, I think everyone knows what I'm going to say here. Do only boring people get bored? James?
I'm really invested in believing that that's not true, because I suffer from boredom myself. And so if I believe that to be true, I'd have to believe that I was boring. And at the very least, my wife doesn't think that's true. I think that when people say only boring people get bored, what they're suggesting is that when they get that boredom signal, they respond to it really quickly and really easily. In our book, we had a conversation with someone who says that, a guy called Chris Hadfield, who some of you may know as the Canadian astronaut who led the International Space Station for a number of years. And Chris claimed that he never gets bored. But if you talk with him for a little bit and you probe a little bit deeper, that you actually get to understand he does indeed feel boredom, but he very quickly gets rid of it. So he tells a story about ploughing fields in his family farm in Ontario, and he enjoys ploughing because he sees a clean field in front of him and a ploughed field behind him, so he can see the progress of his actions. But then he described to me doing what's called harrowing, which is you just basically ploughing an already ploughed field. It's brown dirt in front of you and smaller brown dirt behind you, and you really can't see your progress and you can't feel any achievement. And so what Chris did during harrowing is that he'd challenge himself to see how long he could hold his breath. It's probably not a great idea when you're piloting large farm equipment, but what he was saying is that he was bored while he was harrowing, and so he just decided to engage his mind in a different way. So I don't think only boring people get bored. I think that the people who say that are just really, really good at dealing with being bored. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that there's so much moral judgment around this experience of boredom, and I hope that's something that we can kind of deconstruct today. It's interesting that we judge people who complain of boredom, and we often say things like, well, I'm never bored because my life is so busy and I'm, so occupied with my activities. And I find it fascinating that of all these different feelings, boredom has this kind of complicated emotional judgment around it. And so that'll be good to get into today.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope we'll get some questions on that. And it's really interesting, James, that, and that's really, really clear in the book. It is that, boredom is a sign, and it's kind of what you do with that sign is really interesting and something that's within our control. And I think it's been really difficult within lockdown to find any upside. And some of these big, salons that we're doing are really trying to kind of get to ideas that can help us. And I think, it's perhaps a really, really good time to consider boredom, and it can really, really help us. I know I've read your book. It's fantastic. It can really help you if you know how to read it and know how to deal with it. But it's a difficult one. It's a tricky one. And I just wondered if we can kind of, before we, start going into boredom, if we could have a definition so that we know, what is boredom? What is that feeling of boredom?
So I would say that boredom is this uncomfortable feeling of wanting, but being unable to engage in satisfying activities. And there's two key things that I think are happening in the mind of a bored person. The first thing you could call a desire bind. And, this comes from the work of Leo Tolstoy, who wrote Anna Karenina. And he famously said that boredom is the desire for desires. So the bored person desperately wants to do something, but doesn't want to do any of the available options in front of them. So they're caught in this kind of bound up state. And the second key thing that's happening in the mind of a bored person is that their mind is unoccupied. Their cognitive abilities are underutilized, and they're really itching to engage their mind. And another writer, Saul Bellow, talked about boredom being the pain of unused potential. And so these two things, the unoccupied mind and the desire bind, really underpin this feeling of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. And boredom is also associated with just feeling that time is dragging on, associated with the sense you can't concentrate. Maybe energy levels might be fluctuating. At one moment, kind of lethargic and down, and the next moment maybe irritated and restless. And finally, boredom is associated with the sense that whatever you're doing lacks any meaning or any purpose. And so I think that's kind of how we would sort of choose to define boredom.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And I want to just stay with you for a minute, John. It's like, okay, I get it. I understand what it is. So why do we feel it? What you say in your book that boredom is the price we pay to be emotionally safe. And what does that mean?
Well, that particular quote, comes from more psychoanalytic ideas about boredom. And, thinkers and writers and philosophers and theologians have been thinking about boredom for quite a long time, longer than behavioral scientists. And the traditional psychoanalytic idea is that people experience boredom because they have an impulse or they have some desire that is scandalous or problematic in some way. And so they try to push it out of their mind. And in pushing it out of their mind, they're just left with this empty longing without being able to say what it is that they want to do. And so in the psychoanalytic tradition, you would say that being bored is that price we pay to protect ourselves from those scandalous desires. Now, there are certainly other models of boredom as well. That's not the only way to think about it. But that particular quote that you're referencing comes from that way of thinking about boredom.
Thank you. And are we the only animal to feel boredom?
James, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, not at all. One of my favorite scientific studies of the last decade comes from a couple of researchers in animal veterinary science in the University of Guelph, Rebecca Meager and Georgia Mason. And they did a study with mink in 2012. And they did a really clever thing. So you can't just ask animals, are you bored right now? Are you sad? Are you a little bit lazy or apathetic? You can't do that. You have to be a bit smarter than that in your design. And they were. They had two groups of mink. And so they put one group in cages that were sort of fairly bland and uninteresting. And they put another group of mink in cages that had options that the animals could engage with, things that they could do that would be fun for the mink. And then after 2 weeks of being in these different cages, they showed the animals a variety of things that they could interact with. So they showed them things that the animals would normally see as pleasurable. It turns out that apparently if you show a mink a toothbrush, it's like a laser pointer to a cat. They just love them. There's something about toothbrushes that the mink love. So they showed them things like that they like. They showed them things that they would normally find fearful or aversive. So they showed them, or they exposed them to the smell of the urine of a predator or the silhouette of a predator. And then they showed them neutral things. They showed them a water bottle. And the idea is that if the animals were sad or depressed, then they would show less attraction to the interesting or fun objects. They just wouldn't go to the pleasurable things. If the animal was apathetic and didn't care, well, they showed no interest in any of the objects. If the animal was bored, then they would go to all of the objects equally, and they'd do so quickly. And that's exactly what the mink did. They went to any of the objects. Didn't matter if it was an aversive thing or a fun thing or just a neutral water bottle. They went to them fairly quickly. And then they also sort of looked at how many treats the animals ate after that. And the interesting thing about this is that the animals were fully fed. They were well fed. They were fed and watered and had no need of anything. The animals who'd been in the bored cages ate more treats than the animals that had not been in the bland cages. And so that's something that we see in humans too, that we sometimes overeat when we're bored. So that study, at least, I think is a really clever way of showing that, yes, indeed, animals get bored. But any of the people who are out there listening to us at the moment that have dogs, they would all know that they've seen their animal, they've seen their pet get bored, chasing their own tail, running around aimlessly in their yard, chewing up your shoes when you're not around. That's a bored animal.
Yeah, and I think we all know what it feels like to be have nothing to do and to start eating more, though. That's something that lockdown has really kind of like taught us. But I think, where we are different from the mink is that, and this is one of the big themes of your book, Out of My Skull, is that we must be self-determined. We've got to be engaged with the world on our terms to not experience boredom. But, does that mean that lockdown is a problem for us? Are we more at risk of boredom at the moment because we are lacking our ability to be more self-determined?
I think that the short answer to that is yes. So John mentioned before the Tolstoy quote, which I love, that boredom is the desire for desires. I think the full quote is something a little bit more like, he found this feeling in his heart, a desire for desires, hyphenate ennui. So I don't even think he mentions the word boredom in the quote, but it's not just for any desire. Not any old action won't do. So we don't just desire anything, we desire actions that showcase our skills and talents and that allow us to fully express ourselves as the capable human beings that we know we can be. And so when you put us in lockdown and you constrain the activities that we can do and constrain the ways in which we can do them, yes, I think that does mean that boredom is going to be a bit more difficult and a bit more prevalent to cope with. And there was a study that just came out from Italy a couple of weeks ago, and we should note there's a lot of studies coming out at the moment. They're not all of them have gone through peer review yet, and this is true of this study as well. But they asked people in Italy, what were the worst things that you experienced during social isolation? Well, number one was the loss of freedom, and number two was boredom. And I don't think it's a stretch in these strange times that we find ourselves in to suggest that the loss of freedom is, in this instance, the root cause of our feelings of boredom. John?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that you said, James. I mean, we could play the flip side, though, that I do think that under this period of lockdown, we've stepped away from our busy routines. We've stepped away from the structure of our typical lives. And often, when we're just going on autopilot in our day-to-day life, we don't often pause to reflect on what's really important to us. We don't ask ourselves those questions. We just get on with the next thing on our to-do list. And so for those of us who are now finding this lack of structure, that gives us an opportunity to now pause and reflect and say, who am I? What matters to me? And what do I really want to do? So I agree with James that I think boredom is going to be more, and we know that it's occurring more often. during times of quarantine or isolation or social distancing. But there is a possible silver lining available for us here as well.
Yeah, I do. I mean, one of my favorite answers in the salons we do is often both. You know, because I think it shows the complexity of answering questions. But I think if we kind of go into a little bit more detail into James's approach or answer there, and then we'll come to you, John. But you know, you talk a lot about different types of boredom in the book, and I just wondered if you could, you know, outline which types of boredom are we more at risk at now with lockdown.
Right. I think that in the book we talk a lot about the different things that can lead to boredom, the different circumstances that can bring about that feeling, that sense of boredom. So that things that might be monotonous might bring about boredom. John touched on that, you know, if things don't feel like they have meaning or value or purpose to us, then they're going to be a little bit more boring. I mentioned, you know, with respect to lockdown, constraint, you know, having to do something you don't want to do, that can lead to boredom as well. But they're the same thing. The signal, the warning light that is boredom is the same thing in each of those circumstances, regardless of what has caused it. It's just telling you that you're not engaging with the world in an effective way. You're not engaging in a way that satisfies you somehow. And you need to explore other options for satisfying that need to be engaged, that desire to be engaged. John and I talk about this a little bit in the book, but more so recently with respect to the social isolation, is that there's probably an optimal point of engagement for your mind. And we're now facing this kind of situation where we might not be able to easily maintain that optimal point of engagement. And the interesting thing about that for me is that sometimes that optimal engagement can be, it's not a single set point, it's a range. And so sometimes we might want to just you know, veg out in front of another episode of Tiger King on the Netflix or something. You know, it doesn't really matter if we're not really being active, we're not pursuing meaningful goals, but you know, we just want to relax or something. But at other times, we want to be more engaged and we want to be, you know, doing something that's more meaningful. And when we're in this kind of circumstance, it's those circumstances that are harder to achieve. So I don't think that there's multiple types of boredom. There's multiple roads to boredom. There's multiple ways that it can come about. And then ultimately, we talk about the difference between that in the moment feeling of boredom, what we refer to as state boredom, and the sort of individual difference of the trait propensity to experience it. How, you know, some people experience boredom a lot and they experience it really intensely. And for those individuals, boredom is more of a problem and it's more difficult to deal with. And so that's sort of a distinction that we'd like to make in the book.
Is the restriction the difference between boredom and rest? You know, because, you know, in some cases you're saying, yeah, okay, you want to watch, you know, a TV program, you know, and relax and rest, but it's not enjoyable. It's actually boredom because you're being forced to do it and you don't have agency over how to spend your time. Is that a difference between the two states?
Yeah, I think that choice, or being the sort of master of your own actions, is the key thing here, right? So if you choose to relax, and you know, you had any number of other things you could have chosen to do, then I think you'll find it relaxing. But if you're stuck on the couch because it's the only thing you can do, then it won't be so relaxing. And what are your thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I would agree. I think you explained it well. You know, it's maybe important to distinguish between boredom and relaxation, or boredom and apathy, right? And so boredom is really characterized by that unfulfilled desire. You have a desire for something and it's not fulfilled, right? You want satisfying activity. Whereas when you're relaxed or vegging out, you want for nothing. You're in a calm, more relaxed, peaceful state. At an extreme level, you could think about apathy, where there's a complete lack of any kinds of desires. And so boredom and relaxation might both involve low energy levels, but they differ in terms of that, the absence of that desire for the unfulfilled desire for activity.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I've found that, we run a festival, we run this also festival, which I hope you'll come to one day. I hope everyone at home will come to day. And it's, in 90 acres by a lake, it's beautiful. And we're taking it all online. It's a huge amount of work. I am finding myself yearning for boredom, John. I kind of think, God, I just want to be bored. I really would like some time to be bored. So, I can totally see it's, extremes on both sides here. I think, one question, I think you mentioned it, James, but I'd be really interested to hear from both of you. I know it's a big subject for you, is that why are some people more prone to boredom?
Do you want to tackle that first,
John? Yeah, do you want to go first?
Okay, sure. I'm happy to jump in. I mean, we definitely know that some people are more prone to boredom than others. And, it has to do with their personality and their psychology. And there's a few different factors that we know can lead some to experience boredom more often. First of all, we know some people are just chronically under-energized. And so these are the thrill-seeking people that are looking to jump out of airplanes and do crazy things. And for them, the world is just not stimulating enough. It's not exciting enough. And they need a higher level of energy to be able to concentrate and engage their attention. We also know that people who have weaker attention abilities, so children with ADHD are a prime example of this, they struggle to focus and corral their attention and engage in activities. Interestingly, we also know there's a connection with emotions. So people who struggle to understand their emotions or to name what it is that they're feeling or try to push away their emotions, these folks are more prone to boredom as well. And the idea there is that emotions are like compass points that orient us in life. And if we push our emotions away or we're not aware of them, then it's like being out at sea without your compass and you're kind of adrift and you can't figure out what it is that you want to do. There's a few other factors as well. So we know that motivational style matters. Some people, you might say, are really motivated to maximize pleasure, and others are really motivated to minimize pain. So the maximize pleasure folks, they're going to look for pleasure and enjoyment and happiness in all kinds of activities. But unfortunately, the world is full of mundane activities. Laundry has to be done, the dishes need to be washed. And so if you're very extreme on that pleasure-seeking dimension, you're going to find that the world is just not satisfying. But on the flip side, some people are really motivated to avoid pain or emotional difficulties. So they might say, well, yeah, I could go out to that party tonight, but, Joan is going to be there and we got into a fight last time. It's going to be awkward. I'm going to feel kind of restless. I think I'll just stay home, And so by staying home, you avoid that difficult interaction. But by turtling in like that, you cut yourself off from the opportunity to have satisfying activities. So if you're on extreme on either dimension, that's going to increase the likelihood of boredom.
Fascinating. Thank you, John. James, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so there's something we don't talk about much in the book because the data is sort of a little bit fresh and so not quite out there yet.
Exciting.
One of the things we're interested in is looking at the relationship between self-esteem and boredom. And we're finding in a group of undergraduates that self-esteem at time 1 predicts boredom proneness at time 2. What that sort of says to us is that if you feel like you're an effective agent, if you feel like when you do things in the world, it works, your pursuit of goals is effective, then you're less likely to be bored because you see yourself as being that effective actor in the world. If you're not very effective, then you're more prone to being boredom. And this gets back to a paper from the 1950s by a guy called Robert White. He talks about the jargon phrase is affectance motivation, but essentially he's talking about a drive. And so we know that all animals have appetitive drives, a drive to satisfy hunger and thirst, reproductive drives. White talks about affectance motivation as a drive to act upon the world, to act in a way that shows that your actions had an influence. And I think that's really important in this sort of propensity to be bored. And it's important in our current sort of strange times as well, because we have that capacity to be effective constrained a little bit. We're not able to do what we normally would be able to do. And so that, I think that can really increase our feelings of boredom.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, and I think this takes us back to, the top of the show when you were talking about Chris Hadfield in space and, that idea that we get a sense that we are bored. We get, okay, so we've got the signal. We are bored. How should we act? How do you act in a positive way once you've got the signal? You're bored. What should you do about it?
These T-shirts come out of the UK, I think, don't they? There's a stay calm and then whatever comes afterwards. And so I think John and I should maybe get a T-shirt out that says "Stay calm, be bored." One of the things that both John and I have been saying of late is that, because boredom is so uncomfortable, because you're restless, you're agitated, you don't like the feeling, you tend to sort of be at risk of jumping into these knee-jerk reactions to get rid of it, right? And that might be the overeating that we talked about a little bit earlier. So something that occupies you is not really dealing with what the signal is trying to tell you. So the first thing that you probably need to do is to take a breath and stay calm and say, okay, it's okay to be bored. There can be some positive that will come out of this if I can calmly think about what is it trying to tell me, and it's trying to tell me that I need to figure out what matters most in my life. So the two things, those sort of things, if you did that T-shirt, it would be stay calm, be bored, and choose. The last thing is that, you need to be the person that chooses the action, big or small, that you just need to be consciously making the choices of what action you leap into next. But I think John's got a longer list of how-to responses.
No, I think you really put it succinctly. I think so. Stay calm, be bored, and choose. I like that. Maybe we could insert, around the time of being bored, reflect. Right. So pause and reflect. And James put this in words already, but just to emphasize it, take this as an opportunity to figure out who you are and what matters to you. And then look for activities that flow from and give expression to your passion, your curiosity, and your creativity. And that's on the positive side. And on the negative side, I would say, try to avoid activities that are merely going to entertain you and take the edge off the difficult feeling. There's certainly a time for that. And if it's something that you're actively choosing to do, then that's great. But ultimately, you want to look for activities where you're being more active and more agentic.
Gorgeous. So it's stay calm, be bored, reflect, choose, but on the back, avoid activities that are passive.
There you go. We've got the T-shirt made.
We've got the T-shirt sorted. Thank you. And actually, I think you've answered a question that we've had come in through the chat function, which is our first question through the chat function. It's very exciting. Thank you, Trish. That's brilliant. And she said, really interesting, James and John, to hear your views on boredom. Her question is boredom ever useful? And I think you've just answered that. Yes, it is. And that is a positive way. Trish is asking for positive ways to respond to boredom. And that is it, isn't it?
There's a lot out there. People really want to be able to say something like, boredom makes you creative. And I know that John and I both have a kind of a love-hate relationship with that claim. I think that if you foster creative skills in your life already, and if you have outlets that you've already sort of developed and that you can go to, then those outlets are a fantastic response to being bored. But I don't think you should rely on boredom as an aid to developing that. It is that reflect portion that John's talking about. Pause, reflect, think about it, and then if you have those creative outlets, launching into them is a great way to deal with your boredom. But equally, and this is, I'm aware of my own privilege in having this capacity. Equally, you can get out and weed your garden, and that can deal with your boredom just as well, right? If you feel like you've been the one that chose it, and you see the progress of your actions and you see the fruits of your labors, that'll get rid of your boredom too.
Yeah, I think that's why so many of us have really taken solace in making bread, or kind of unusual, time-consuming, but very gratifying, skills and real crafts that perhaps you were never going to get round to without lockdown. But it's not boring. Making bread isn't boring. It takes about 2 days. Okay, so I just wanted to mention age and boredom. I used to work on a TV show for teenagers, and one of the things that there was always, one of the notes that was always given is that, you know, the writers were not capturing the relationship between teenagers and boredom. Which is quite hard to do in television, but it was kind of like, you know, the research that was coming in that, you know, about teenagers was really, you know, that they had a lot more experience of boredom than other age groups. And I wondered if that was true, or if you could talk to us a little bit about boredom and age groups.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start off here. So we definitely know that between approximately the age of 10 and the age of 18, that boredom levels go up, as you said, and that from age 18 down to midlife, they drop. And then they might have a kind of a late life surge again. And so the question is, why are teens or young adults more prone to boredom than others? And, you know, we don't know for sure, but we can speculate based on what we know about the developing teen. So the first thing we know is that, you know, teens are still developing the part of their brain that's responsible for organizing and coordinating their plans. And so they're still developing that ability to make a plan and then follow through on it effectively. And it's not until that part fully develops that they're going to be able to engage in that high level of self-control. We also know, though, that teens are just subject to a lot of restrictions and a lot of limits, right? They're starting to develop more and more autonomy and desire for autonomy, but they're having to deal with the constraints of the adult world. And they're bumping up against that and trying to develop their own independence. And so I think that's another factor to consider. You know, and adolescents or young adults simply may not be as busy either. So we know that life circumstances are going to be playing a role as well. I don't know, James, did you want to add anything to that about teens and boredom?
I don't know. I think you've captured it well. There's a great phrase from a developmental researcher, Ronald Dahl, that says it's like giving the keys to the car to an inexperienced driver. Anyone who's got teenagers, and I have a 15-year-old myself, knows that they're emotionally reactive, but not quite cognitively capable yet. So, you know, the most common thing I hear out of my 15-year-old's mouth is, "I'm 15, you know." So, as though that should mean he's fully capable of everything.
But going back to your the question that you brought up about creativity, which I was so glad you did, you know, I think for teenagers that often haven't had the chance to develop the skills that sustain you through boredom. You know, they haven't had the chance to, you know, pick up a guitar or do sourdough, or don't want to. You know, it takes time to find these, you know, reflective, useful ways of dealing with boredom that help you feel engaged and in charge of your own life. It's an interesting one. It's a tough time, I think, for teenagers. I wanted to move on to the search for meaning, which you really cover in a lot of detail. And it is incredible, the relationship between meaning in our lives and boredom. And you know, you say that boring situations impoverish us as meaning makers. Sorry, yeah, so that's boring situations impoverish us as meaning makers. And I just wanted to ask you, you know, what do you mean, and why is that a problem?
Yeah, well,
John, yeah.
All right, yeah. So, you know, there is definitely a tight connection between meaning and boredom. You know, when we're bored, we feel as if the situation we find ourselves in lacks any meaning, and the discomfort of boredom kind of pushes us to search for meaning. You know, and the connection between boredom and meaning has a long history. We could think about some of the existential writers like Viktor Frankl, you know, writing and sort of his harrowing account of experience in Nazi concentration camps talked about that will to meaning that humans have. And for him, an absence of meaning, or that existential vacuum, as he put it, was mainly expressed or manifest in terms of boredom. So someone who lacks meaning and purpose feels bored. That's how it expresses or how it shows up for them. And, you know, in our lab, we did one study where we brought people into the lab and we asked half of the people to reflect on a time in their life that was particularly meaningful to them, where they acted in a way that was consistent with their values and their beliefs. And we asked another group of people to reflect on a time in their life that lacked meaning and purpose, where they maybe behaved in a way that was inconsistent with their values. And after that, we measured boredom levels. And, sure enough, people who reflected on a time when their life lacked meaning reported higher boredom levels. So it does appear that life meaning can contribute to the feelings of boredom. But you talk specifically about that quote about boring situations empowering us. And I think that's really interesting. I think boring situations and boring people, they rob us of the chance to make meaning. So it's not just about having a meaning that is fixed, that we settle on for the rest of our lives. Humans are natural meaning makers. We want to be engaged in the process of connecting with the world to bring something forward that's not there before we show up, so that we get to act together with the world in this dance and create something new, create meaning. And I would say that boring situations, and also back to the top of our talk today, boring people and boring situations, I think rob us of the opportunity to make meaning. They objectify us or make us superfluous, unnecessary. We don't bring anything to the table in those moments. One of our colleagues who also does research on boredom, a philosopher working out of the US, Andreas Elpiduro, he has a really nice phrase that I love. He talks about the world of boredom is, in a sense, not our world. So it's a world that doesn't flow from our desires or our projects. And that's, I think, trying to illustrate this idea that we need to be actively engaged in making meaning to stave off that feeling of boredom.
Wow, that's that's beautiful. Thank you.
One of the things that became evident, though, for John and I when we were working on the book is that there is a tendency, I think, in boredom literature to sort of stop at the meaning account, to just say, boredom is a lack of meaning, and now we've understood it. And I think we both wanted to sort of suggest that that's not the case, that, yes, meaning plays an important role in how we experience boredom and how we respond to it. But that, your sense of agency. And so when John's talking about, that feeling that we are robbed of our capacity to actually make meaning, what we're being robbed of is our sense of agency, our sense of our own ability to contribute to the meaning of a situation. One of the things examples that we came up with, I'm not sure if we put it in the book, John, maybe Helen, you'll remember it better than I will. You can imagine situations that are particularly meaningful to do, but kind of boring. And the one I remember coming up with was that, when your child at 4 years of age or so first learns the structure of a knock-knock joke, the thing they want to do is just tell knock-knock jokes ad nauseum. They just tell them over and over and over and over again. Now, it's really meaningful to spend a bit of time with your 4-year-old interacting and having them laugh uproariously at unfunny knock-knock jokes. But it gets kind of tedious after a while too, right? So meaning is really important, but it's not the final part of the account of boredom that we would like to tell.
Okay. So I kind of want to move on to the internet and the amount of information that's available and technology. And I think there's a lot that we could talk about that. But, I guess the first question I want to ask you is, is boredom on the rise? Are we in a time of a boredom epidemic? And if we are, how can that be when so much information is available to us?
There's so much about that question that's really difficult to answer.
Oh, good.
In one sense, what's happening there is that we're going down the rabbit hole of trying to blame technology for any rise that there might be, even if we can measure that rise. And there was a book that came out a while back that caused a stir, saying the internet is making you dumber. And John and I want to be very careful not to sort of buy into a kind of hyperbolic, shrill sort of claim that, yes, we're on the cusp of a boredom epidemic. It's also really very hard. How do you find a group of people who don't have a smartphone, who don't have internet access, who aren't on social media? It's very hard as scientists for us to find a control group where we can say, this group hasn't got any of the technology and so they're less bored, and this group does have the technology and so they are more bored. And then to top it all off, what I think you're really asking is it on the rise over a course of decades? Is the boredom that's with us now worse than it was in 1970? And it's just so hard to get that data. There is a hint on a recent study that we weren't able to include in the book because it came out after we'd already gone through the proofs, that there was a study, I think it was in the United States, suggesting over about a 2 or 3 year span in, again, teenagers that were sort of in the 14, 15, 16-year-old range, that in the same individuals, that indeed they were showing a rise in the report of boredom in that very short time span. Now that does not an epidemic make, right? But it is a hint, at least, that there is some sort of rise. But then there's also this challenge that we turn to technology, we turn to the internet, we turn to our smartphones, we turn to Candy Crush, we turn to these things as a pacifier of boredom. And there is a lot of good work showing that our relationship to our devices can become problematic if we're not careful. And that can be that we reach for the smartphone, we reach for the social media outlets, whichever ones you're doing, we reach for them whenever we're bored without thinking. And that seems to be that is a potential problem for people nowadays. I don't know, John, do you want to add to
that? No, I think, you said a lot there, James. It's really helpful. One thing I might just throw in the mix here is, I was really fascinated reading Bertrand Russell in his Conquest of Happiness, writing in the 1930s. He talked about boredom not being more prevalent. So here he was talking about the 1930s, boredom not being more prevalent than it was in the past, but that our fear of boredom has grown. And so that's another kind of interesting twist on your question about what's changed over time. I think with ready, accessible technology, we have so many quick ways to numb that feeling that James just described. And I think that might have, here I'm speculating, but it may have fostered a greater fear of boredom within us. We don't have as many opportunities to sit with this discomfort and then learn that, hey, it's not so bad, I can get through it. Because right away we can grab our phones or whatever the case may be to make that feeling go away.
But I guess my big question is, why isn't this knowledge, the internet, all that information, why isn't it a solution to boredom?
Well, one thing I'll just say about that is, it's really important to recognize that boredom is not just an absence of possibility, right? Or it's not an absence of stimulation. It flows from, as we talked about, those two key factors, the desire mind and the unoccupied mind. And sometimes more choice can actually be disorienting. You go into the grocery store and you want to buy a box of cereal and you've got 3 choices, or you've got 20 choices. When you have 20 choices, it can be a lot harder to choose, and you can be less satisfied with the choice that you make at the end of the day. So a lot of opportunities for activities doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be less bored. It may actually present us with more challenges in the long run.
John had a great phrase that he used in the book that was, it can feel like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much information and it's coming at you so quickly that it can become overwhelming.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that description. And, I'm going to go to questions, but just one little question was that, in response to that, you say that people can have a couple of responses, neither of which can be that positive. One is to retreat away from all the noise and from all the information, which can kind of like push you back into a group where you feel more comfortable and less kind of pushed around by information. And the other one is to try and compete by screaming over the noise, something you call ego screaming, or is called ego screaming. Neither seem particularly good responses to boredom. Is that right?
Yeah, those are the extremes of trying to deal with this problem of making sense. And again, this gets back to what John was talking about in terms of we are meaning-making beasts, and so when there's so much out there, it becomes really challenging to make meaning. And one response, and you see this in internet sort of trolling, Twitter trolling, that kind of thing, is to scream louder. And that ego screaming phrase comes from Oren Clapp, who worried about this kind of behavior in 1986. So, and this notion that technology is ruining us goes back to Socrates too. So we've always had this kind of concern that increases in information and increases in the ease of information are not going to be good for us. But think there is some good evidence that, we do turn to that as a pacifier for boredom, and either we try and scream louder or we retreat. And as you say, yeah, that both of those responses are not good in the long term.
It's fascinating, predicting everything we have now in 1986. Okay, I've got a great question from Phil for you. And that is, I don't know whether it's for John or for James, is can you get bored to death?
Well, so there's a study actually that I think came out of the UK. It was an epidemiological study by Britton and Shipley. And what they did is they looked at responses to surveys that were taken in the 1970s of British civil servants. And they asked them, how bored are you with your job? And then they measured things like, causes of death decades later. And it turned out that the people who were more bored in their job in the 1970s did have a higher tendency of dying from heart disease later on. It's one of these sort of connections that you can make and too much of. So I think the answer is no, you can't really be bored to death, but it's if poor responses to boredom are probably not good for your mental health, and anything that's not good for your mental health is also likely to have some flow-on consequences for your physical health. So we know that things like severe anxiety will also have problems for sort of cardiovascular fitness. But yeah, it would be nice to have a simple answer to say yes and be afraid, be very afraid. But I think it's the answer is much more complex than that.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. I've got a question from Albin. Hello, Albin. Welcome back. And she says she wants to ask more about why we are bored by other people sometimes, or people are bored by each other. And she says, when I am bored by others, it's less to do with what they talk about than a kind of disconnect, either from them or between the two people talking. Couldn't boredom then be a lack of connection or even intimacy?
That's for John.
John.
Okay, I'll wade into that one and try. I think it was Albin you said. Yes, I agree that the key issue is the connection, a breakdown in the connection between the two people. And, as I said, somewhat in a cheeky way, that I think boring people objectify others. So what I mean by that is boring people make other people irrelevant or superfluous. They don't really engage the other person as a person. They might talk at them, they might talk to them, they might lecture them, but they're not inviting a true dialogue that allows the speaker or allows us to come forward. True dialogue allows us to sort of really unfold, you might say, and discover ideas, and a boring person kind of thwarts that process. And so I would agree that it's not about the behaviors of the boring person, but that they thwart this healthy kind of connection between two people that the questioner spoke of there.
Oh, that's great, John. Actually, that's the second time that's come up, so I just want to clarify it. Are you saying we need to avoid boring people?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm not sure how to answer that.
Okay.
I think we should strive to have healthy relationships with the people around us. And I think that if we're confronted with someone who is boring us, I think our job is to do the best we can to really pay attention to them and try to draw them out as a real, genuine person, allow them to present themselves to us for true dialogue. But at the end of the day, if they continue to just talk at us and don't really engage us, then, we can be polite and move on and find someone who will see us as another human being.
Ah, that's beautifully tactfully done. Thank you, John. And excellent advice. Really good advice. Thank you. Okay, I've got a question from Molly. Thank you, Molly. The question is, John and James, do you think that being bored is good because it gives people time to think?
Yeah, I can take that if you like. Yes, it's the short answer. I think this capacity, or if we take on that challenge that boredom poses, if we don't try to immediately outrun boredom and just avoid it, and instead as John says, spend a bit of time to reflect on what it means for us, then yeah, it can be absolutely a good signal. It can be something that we can use to think more carefully about what are the pursuits and the goals that we really want to go for and go after. So yeah, it can be a good thing and a bad thing. It's really about how we respond to it and what choices we make. But we can always make good choices to it.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add to that? I totally agree with that. And I would say, to extend this idea, that what we want to do is be in situations that are perhaps understimulating, or where the external pressure has kind of receded a little bit. We want to be in those situations and learn how to reflect and not be bored, right? So as James said, feeling bored in the short term can be helpful, but it's not a state that we want to persist in. It's not something we want to foster. And the real key is to be able to take a situation that might otherwise be boring and find a way to reflect and maybe daydream and engage in our thoughts, and in so doing not become bored.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Molly. We've got a question from Annie. And the question is, I was wondering if James and John had an opinion about the idea of existential boredom as a type of mood. Sometimes people talk about it as something that can take over your people's lives completely. Do you think that that's really boredom in the everyday sense? John?
Sure, I'll give it a try, and then we can see if James wants to add anything. I think lack of life meaning, sort of an existential angst, is a very big idea, and it sort of covers a broad feeling about your whole life, as the caller is saying. It's a mood that pervades how we see the world around us. And I think boredom is often a little bit more of a specific or a more local feeling. And so I think it's important not to confuse lack of life meaning and boredom. But certainly I think if you have prolonged or repeated experiences of boredom, that can give rise probably to a more generalized feeling that your life lacks meaning and purpose. And we certainly know the opposite causal direction is better established, that if a person generally feels that their life lacks meaning and purpose, they will often be bored. And the idea there is, again, they're going to have a hard time figuring out what they value and what's important to them, and then engaging the world on the basis of that valuing. James, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Well, I will, just to sort of say that you can think about it from the other side of the problem, as in, what do I do, right? And so I've been using this anecdote a little bit too much lately, but I'll use it again here. I was bored myself a couple of weeks ago at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, which is characteristic of the feeling of boredom. I want something, but I don't know what I want. And then I hit upon it, what I was going to do. And I decided, I called my mum in Australia and I said, remember that coffee cake that we used to make when I was 10? Give me the recipe. She gives me the recipe, and I made a coffee cake. Now, there's nothing that contributes to any grand sense of life meaning. That doesn't help me develop or foster or put forward a huge sort of sense of purpose about my life. But it really did get rid of my boredom in that moment. So if you think that, actions big and small can alleviate your boredom, what's key is not the content of the action, but that you chose it as a means of expressing yourself as an agent in the moment, in the here and now. And then I think you can probably say, yeah, as John pointed out, that life meaning is an important part of this, but it's not the only part. And so we don't need to address our feelings of boredom by somehow taking on big projects every time. That's not going to work.
That's really, really good advice. And that's something that I keep saying it's a take home, but we're all at home. So I don't know what it is, but home. But, that idea that, yeah, it's that deciding in the moment, something positive that you've decided to do is the important thing. It doesn't have to be, right, I'm going to learn flamenco guitar in the next 6 weeks. It can, yeah, it could be something small that you choose to do that has meaning to you, that is important.
Absolutely, and I think run risks actually in this time, with the social isolation and distancing and all that kind of stuff, that if we set big goals, we might get, we might set ourselves up for failure on those goals, and then we'll end up in a vicious cycle of feeling worse about ourselves for having not achieved them. One of the things that I think John talks about as a motivational factor that got him into boredom research is counseling typically young men who had these sense of failed life projects that led them to boredom. I don't want to put words in your mouth, John, but just because we're on lockdown doesn't mean we should be choosing these big projects now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we haven't had time to go into it, but you do talk very much in the book about how too much stimulation can be just as boring as too little, which is really fascinating. We'll have to do another talk another time. One last quick question, and then I just want to ask you a couple of questions in conclusion. But it's great. It's from Candice, and it is, why did I get bored of Zoom so quickly?
I'll say something quickly, and then I'll pass it over to John. First, there's two things I want to say about that, Candice. And first thing is, where would we be without it? I mean, it has given us the capacity to interact with people in a circumstance where we can't physically do that. So I think we'd all have to admit that it's been great to have Zoom, but it's not the real thing. And so why are you bored of Zoom? Because it's not the real thing. It's not that connectedness John was talking about before in answer to Molly's question. It's not that connectedness that we're really searching for. Would you agree, John?
Yeah, yes, I would agree. And, James, you often use the word simulacrum, right? It's sort of like technology offers the illusion of the real, but not the real thing. And with Zoom, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is with Zoom, there's little micro delays in the voice and the face, and it's just confusing for us as a biological creature because it feels something's off. There's this uncanny feeling. And I think that leads to fatigue and a low level of stress. And so I think that makes this kind of simulacrum of reality less satisfying. And ultimately, what we really are craving is those real connections, whatever they may be, with people or with real objects.
Yeah, I think that's something else I definitely took away from the book was this idea that you should make a distinction between, kind of like junk interactions, with technology, with information, with the internet, and things that are really meaningful with the internet, like this, like coming to a salon is a meaningful Zoom interaction. But, a 4-hour conversation about, next week's meeting might not be. It might be something that is boring. Okay, I'm so sorry, Ben. I had not seen your question. We have one more question before I want to go to a conclusion. So from Ben, thank you for your question, Ben. And he says, some people are afraid to be bored, so throw themselves into work because of the sense of productivity and sometimes meaning in that. Is that would you call that a false sense of meaning, John?
Yeah, sure. I'll just take a crack at that. Yeah, I think that's probably right. And one way to overcome any fear is to gradually expose ourselves to it and to sit with it in small doses. And I think that that's one way we can overcome that fear of boredom is to learn to tolerate the distress and recognize that you can work your way through it. I think anytime you're running to an activity to avoid distress, then it's a problem, right? Because you're not doing the activity because you are choosing and agentically saying, this is what I want to do and what I'm passionate about. You're saying, I'm doing this because I have to, because otherwise I'll feel very bad. And so, that would be, again, back to the theme that we're emphasizing here. That would be, a lack of agency. You feel vulnerable in the face of fear. And so you rush to lose that uncomfortable feeling in work or busyness. Brilliant.
James? No? Okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything really much to add to that. It really is about being the one who chooses it. Interesting point that Ben makes, though, because people who suffer from ADHD will often see boredom as a sort of a feeling to be fearful of and wanting to avoid as well, and it goes hand in hand with the struggles that they have to deal with their attention deficit. And there's some hint too that in people who suffer from sort of other mental health issues, particularly depression, that boredom might feel like this early warning sign to be afraid of. But as John says, just trying to outrun it rather than face it and deal with it is not going to be a long-term solution.
Thank you. And thank you for a brilliant question, Ben. So I guess just to kind of wrap up, I just wanted to ask, does this time of lockdown, does it give us a chance to try and end that cycle of desire, action, new desire?
I think that so if I were a Buddhist monk, I might suggest that if I could do without all desire, then I would also do without all pain. But I think that pain is an important part of living. Desires are an important part of living. I think that it makes us who we are to want to try and achieve things, to want to try and have an influence in the world around us and have an influence in the people that we interact with. So I don't know that we're going to, have desire, goal, desire. I don't think that we want to get out of that. I think that we want to recognize it for what it is and recognize that we are responsible for how we act. We're responsible for the choices that we make and how we engage with the world. And so I think that's the main thing that I would go for is be conscious of your choices, whether it be to binge watch something on Netflix for another hour, or whether it be to sort of pick up the flamenco guitar that you whatever it is, be conscious of your choices.
Okay, lovely. And another message seems to be very much to let the ordinary things thrill you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very happy with my giant ice cubes, but that's a whole other salon. Okay, so just to wrap up, I just want to mention your book, Out of My Skull, which you have written, and it is out next month. And if anyone would like a copy, please buy it from us, not them. You know who they are. Amazon. I can't say anything about them, but anyway, we'd love to sell it to you if you'd like to. It's a brilliant exploration of boredom. But my final question is quite a fun one, and that was just to say, did you not want to write a boring book so that it could be really immersive of your subject?
Yeah, well, that would have been a real literary feat.
I think actually doing what we did was a risk-taking exercise, because what if it turned out that what we did was boring?
It's not. It's incredibly well written, and it has a huge recommendations for how you can really seek out activities to really get you towards where you want to be in life, and how you want to think about how to live, which is just all you can ask for in a book. In my book, and I'm just trying to find the T-shirt that we need to produce. Stay calm, be bored. Reflect and choose and avoid passive forms of activity, and we can embrace our boredom and get the most out of it. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much, James. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
It's been so brilliant to explore boredom with you. Congratulations on your fabulous book, Out of Your Skull, and I'll speak to you soon. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming along to explore boredom. As I said, this is our Salon lockdown series to explore big ideas and spend a bit of time with really interesting ideas during lockdown. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us. I hope we'll see you again at another Salon lockdown. Or please do check out our festival, the Also Festival, which we are doing online in the middle of June, I think. No, in the middle of May. I think it's next weekend, but I'll try not to think about that. So no time to be bored here. Thank you so much. This salon is now closed.